Hey, how are you today? This is Josh Patrick, and you're at Cracking the Cash Flow Code. My guest today is Chris Volk. Chris is the author of an upcoming book. It's called TheValueEquation.com, and it's how people in privately held businesses like yours create value. So instead of me talking about the value equation is, because I have no idea what it is, Chris is going to tell us. Let's bring Chris on and we'll start the conversation. Hey, Chris, how are you today?
Josh, it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for having me on your show.
Oh, my pleasure. So, what is the value equation?
Yeah, so the value equation is a six-variable equation. I started my career as just a commercial banker, lending to all kinds of companies, so big and small, and but mostly kind of middle market companies, just the kinds of companies that you have on your subscriber base. And I learned early on that like some companies just had better business models than others. I mean, they just do. And so you're trying to figure out how that all works. And I used to model companies out on spreadsheets and make long and complicated analysis of this stuff. And ultimately, I decided to try to simplify it. And I started cutting down the variables and cutting down the size of my spreadsheets. And finally, I just got down to six variables. I like literally threw the spreadsheet away and just came up with a six-variable equation, which is probably pretty accessible for anybody that's a customer of yours or subscriber of yours. It's just all middle school math. It focuses on what you like to focus on, which is cash flow, and because that's sort of the essential part of what makes businesses work. And so if you string those equations together, the variables together, the result you get, the initial result, is just what's called a current return on equity. It's sort of a cash flow number. It's a current cash flow return on shareholder equity, and that's the foundation for all business value and business success. That's what defines, if you take that equation and you map it out, that single number is going to help understand how much you're going to grow going forward. If you reinvest the money, what's your maximum growth rate going to be? What's your company going to be worth? Because when you're selling a company, somebody's going to be looking at your current cash flow return on equity, and they're going to be comparing it to what they want to get. And so if you can generate a 20% return, but they want 10, then your equity is worth twice what you paid for it. And that, by the way, is the name of the game. The name of the game is to make a company worth more than it cost to put together. And most companies in America and around the world do not rise to that level. They just don't. It's hard to do. But if you look at the Forbes 400 list of people, that's how they all made their money. And the richest people in the world tended to make their money in business, and they tended to make it by building businesses that were worth more than they cost to create. So this is a book that shows you how that's done.
So, what are some of the variables that you look at when you say, okay, you're getting a return better than what it costs you to create the business?
Yeah, so there's six variables, and they're not really intuitive because you're trying to focus on finance. Most of your, I'm sure all your subscribers in private companies, they have accountants doing their numbers, and they probably don't understand. Most business people don't understand all the accounting as well as they might, but they sure understand finance. They know how much cash they got in the bank. If they have a piece of equipment, they know what it costs. And so what I try to do is focus on those kinds of realities, because finance is sort of like music. It's a universal language, whereas accounting is not a universal language. It's there are lots of ways to do accounting and to slice the financials with numbers. So the six numbers, I'll tell you what they are. The first number is sales. The sales number is pretty simple, and no company ever went out of business because they had too many sales. The second number is business investment, and business investment is, there's a chapter on business investment, because a lot of people just don't understand what business investment is, and not understanding what business investment is can make you actually go out of business. There's a story I had where there's a guy named Damon John, who you may know. Damon's a pretty well-known guy on Shark Tank, and he came and spoke to an event that we had one time. And as he was starting his company, he almost ran out of money because he had given people 120-day terms to pay him his bills. And he just didn't have the cash flow to bridge the 120-day gap. he had nobody to lend him the money. So and one of the truths about business is people don't go out of business because they lose money. They go out of business because they run out of cash. And so Damon came preciously close to running out of cash. And so business investment is basically what it sort of sounds like, where it's the hard money you're paying for furniture, fixtures, equipment, but it's also receivables, it's inventory. You subtract your accounts payable and accruals because they don't really cost you anything, and you come up with a number that's business investment. And there's no sort of accounting convention to it. So you don't say my investment in fixed assets, like my investment in machinery, is reduced by depreciation. You can't actually reduce the cost of something. I mean, it costs $1 million. It costs $1 million. An accountant might depreciate it down to 500,000, but it still costs $1 million. And I mean, your average person understands that. And so you say,
here's the problem with depreciation. It's a tax construct. It has nothing to do with running a business.
No, exactly. I mean, it's you can't mystically make something just worth less, right, or cost less, and sometimes it is worth less. By the way, I mean, but I've run 3 real estate-based companies, and they're really finance companies, but sort of heavy real estate investment, and we threw off boatloads of depreciation every single year. But every time we sold a piece of real estate, we tend to sell for what we paid for it or more. So the depreciation was actually fictitious. So it was nothing. Whereas with some companies, it is. Anyway, so that's business investments. Your second variable. Your third variable is operating profit margin, which basically is the percentage of revenues that you're making in cash flow. Operating profit margin, and you're backing out depreciation and amortization when you're doing that. So you're backing out any non-cash accounting conventions, and there's a guide in the book that shows you how to do that. But you are including your own salary. A lot of people in business don't do this. They think somehow that their salary comes from the bottom. But when you're trying to value a business and make it worth more than the cost, your salary needs to be taken out right up top, because if you weren't there, somebody else had to run that business. And so the question is, what's that business worth without you? Because that's a really true test of a business that is worth more than the cost to create. And then this next 2 variables.
Hold on for one second, Chris.
Yeah.
Now, is your profit margin after tax or before tax?
I start off before tax. So most of the book is going to start off before tax, because, of course, a lot of companies in the United States are LLCs or sub assets. A lot of your customers are like that. But really, the after-tax number becomes pretty important. I mean, and so there's a lot of discussion in the book also about the after-tax number. When you're valuing a company, you can value a company on a before-tax number or an after-tax number. I mean, so somebody could say, here's the pre-tax return I want to get on a business on a current basis. So an investor might think that way, where they could be focusing on the after-tax return. But most of them, if you look at most valuation conventions, it tends to be pre-tax.
Okay. And what's next?
So the next 2 variables are the percentage of OPM you're using. And I didn't use debt. I used the term OPM, other people's money, because OPM is the amount you're either borrowing or you're getting from other people as a loan or proceeds that they want to earn interest income on. So, for example, over the years, I was involved in owning a lot of real estate that was rented to people. I mean, it could have been manufacturing facilities, it could have been veterinary clinics, whatnot. So we would own the building and rent that building to the tenant. And the tenant had a choice. They could have owned the real estate themselves. They might have done that. But they chose to have a landlord rather than a banker. So if the building hypothetically cost $1 million, then we would buy the building for $1 million and just rent it to them. Their alternative would have been to borrow the money from a bank. And of course, the bank wasn't going to lend them $1 million because they're not going to lend the full value of the asset. So the bank would lend them $600,000 to $700,000, 60 to 70% of the building, and then they'd have to put up $300,000 to $400,000 in equity. Totally viable capital stack. A lot of companies do that, but there are also some shortcomings to people doing that. So when you're talking about OPM, it could be companies like us where we're providing lease proceeds on buildings that you could otherwise own, or equipment. You think about a construction company, people can either rent construction equipment or they can own it. Same deal. Airlines around the country can rent aircraft or they can own aircraft. From a capital stack perspective, all these things are viable options, renting or owning, but you should do them, side by side against each other and say, here are the proceeds that I'm getting from people, and what's the proceeds relative to my business investment? And to do it that way, then now you're not thinking in accounting terms, because accountants are going to look at leases and book them in a bizarre fashion, and it's going to be totally different. So if you're a business person, you don't care about any of that stuff. You just say, I don't want to own the building. I want to rent it. And I want this company. And in this case, I ran a company called Store Capital most recently, and say, I want Chris to own the building and rent it to me. And the next thing is the interest rate on that. So, what's the rate that's going to be charged? So those two things is the percentage of the company, the percentage of business investment that's funded with OPM, and then what's the cost of the OPM? And then there's one more variable, and the variable is what's called maintenance capex. It's basically, what does a company have to put and invest in itself just to sort of maintain the business? So you could be a construction company. You're having to replace construction equipment that's worn out over time. Let's say you're a consumer-facing business. I mean, you could be a place where you have a building where people come into it all the time. It could be a restaurant, could be a retail establishment. And every single year, you're going to have things that wear out that you have to replace. But then you're also going to have, every 5 years or so, you're going to have maybe an overall remodel just to sort of redo this. And so as you're looking at it, you want to even all this stuff out. And I even include most of the multi-unit, consumer-facing businesses I've ever done business with invariably lose money on stores at some point. I mean, you could take a company like Walmart, where they closed down Sam's Clubs all the time, or they took small Walmarts and then built them into bigger super Walmarts. There's a cost to doing all that stuff. And so if you're looking at a true business model and you want to incorporate those real costs of doing that, making some decisions on losing money on assets, you would put that in this maintenance capex number that I've devised. And those are the 6 variables. And you string them all together, and you can calculate a current return on equity on a pre-tax or after-tax basis.
So how do you string them all together? Because there's different, you have percentages and dollars, and so how do you go about doing that?
Well, the value equation is done all in percentages, and that's part of the beauty of it. That's why it works so well. So a return on equity is a percentage number. It's I'm making a current return of 10% or 20%. And so what you're trying to do is create a universal truth. I mean, if you take any business and you put in the real numbers for the business, what you can ultimately do, if you decide to, is you could take the numbers away, because the numbers stop mattering, because they're just relationships. So, for example, there's a relationship between sales to business investment. You could have a company that's doing sales of $1 million a year, and they have business investment of $1.5 million. Or let's do it a different way. Let's say they have sales of $1.5 million, they have a business investment of $1 million. So if you take sales to business investment, that's a 1.5 ratio. So basically, if you take 1.5 times the operating profit margin, you're going to start to string together something. If you have a company that has maintenance capex, and the maintenance capex is 2% of investment every year, or 4% of investment every year. I'm talking about business investment here. Then you could just put in the 2% or 4% number. You don't even need to use the real number, and you don't need to use business investment. So you can actually understand what your numbers are and what your levers are to be able to make your business worth more than it costs to create. And you have, if you look at the 6 numbers in there, they divide into sort of 3 kinds of categories. And the first is operating efficiency, which is a lot of people spend a lot of time focusing on operating efficiency. So improving profit margins, raising prices. It's just, the sales number is important there. The operating profit margin is important there. The second is going to be asset efficiency. And asset efficiency is trying to invest the least amount you can in assets. I mean, if you can invest in a smaller amount of assets, then your business investment ends up being less. And there's been a lot of pressure on global businesses to do this, where you're having more asset-like type models where businesses sort of shrink down. And you can look even at the biggest businesses like Apple, where it says that the machines are designed in California, but they're made everywhere else, because Apple's not even putting in the fixed cost to do all this stuff. So they're reducing their business investment to improve their business model. And that's really incumbent on all of us to try to figure that out. So that's where you get into just-in-time inventory. You got the least amount invested in inventory you can. You're trying to get your customers to pay as fast as they can, so you have fewer receivables. All this stuff is asset efficiency, and you're trying to keep it down. And the last one is capital efficiency, which is where you're trying to, have the mix of OPM and equity, and you're trying to keep that mix good. I mean, you can actually make a lot of money by having a decent capital mix. And a lot of people in businesses don't understand that. Sometimes I've seen companies bought by people who've put no money down and gotten away with it, in part because the seller didn't have the imagination to understand how you could actually finance the business. And so the seller basically undersold the business because they didn't realize that somebody else could so materially different from theirs. So it's important.
Private equity groups do that pretty much all the time. So I have a question for you, because a thought occurred to me. Happens every once in a while, which is I can see where I want to use other people's money as much as I can, which means I would want to rent stuff versus owning it, if under many circumstances. However, for personal financial planning, especially for smaller, blue collar businesses, if they own the real estate that they operate in, and 15 years later it's paid off, it becomes a really good personal financial asset. But it should never be in the corporation to start off with, so it should never be a corporate asset. So it seems to me that there has to be some personal financial planning that goes along with the corporate financial planning to get the owner to financial freedom so they can afford to leave their business at some point in the future. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I would say that if for a person wanting to own their real estate, and you're correct that people tend to take their real estate and they take it and they put it into a propco, and so they have the opco on one side and a property company on the other side. But when you're doing that, what you're doing is you're making an investment, right? So the real estate becomes an investment. It's distinct and different from the company investment, and it's like buying a stock or a bond. And there are a lot of former owners of companies who've sold their companies but kept the real estate and rented the real estate to the subsequent buyer, and retained that. There are pluses and minuses to it. The minus would be, the pluses are pretty obvious. I mean, you're making an investment, you're building up an asset value into your estate. The minus is that in choosing to own the real estate, you are actually taking away from money that you could have invested in the business. And so if you could have invested the money in the business returns tend to be, not just tend to be, they're almost always higher than the returns on real estate. So, so if you don't have anything to do with the money, if you can't reinvest it in the business, and the business is a finite size and you can't grow it, then you're really good owning the real estate. But if you could have had something better to do with the money and put it into the business, you're better off. And of course, when people choose to rent real estate, they're really making that decision where they're saying, I don't want to take the 30 or 40% down payment and put equity and tie it up into the real estate. I want to take that money and I want to put it in my business. And I want to grow, and I think I can generate a higher rate of return.
So we get into a different problem, which this brings up, which is most business owners, and I'm going to say probably 75 to 90% of businesses in this country, they may be able to find a better use for it, but they don't have the operational capability of growing their business. So they may have built a business up to, say, 15 to 25 employees. And they don't have the ability to build a business of 50 employees because they have no idea how to manage 50. and that could put them out of business all by itself. So for those folks, if they're not willing to learn how to be great delegators, staying at 15 to 25 employees is probably a smart thing to do, but they're not going to get the cash flow from a business sale that'll allow them to retire. So that's where investment real estate comes in, and owning that real estate and renting it to the next owner of the business. So it's, when you get into smaller businesses, it's really a different equation than when you're talking about, I have a client with 450 employees. What you're talking about would make absolutely perfect sense to him. But then I've got another client that's got 12 employees. And if I said to him, well, we're going to put all our money back in here and grow you to 50, he may or may not, mostly may not, say, gee, that's not the best idea for me. And they may not say it that nicely.
Yeah, well, I mean, they're the two fastest ways that companies can go out of business are to try to grow organically, like we're talking about. It's where you're taking your money and investing, and to do it too fast. I mean, I've watched over the years and seen customers of ours who have expanded at paces that just outstrip their ability to run the business, and they've lost control of the business, and it's caused the business to basically just crater. And the sideshow to that, the second way that businesses go out of business pretty easily is trying their hand at M&A, where they're trying to buy another business, because most people are like really good at running their business, but they're not so good at trying to figure out how to buy another business, which is a skill set all by itself. And they're not really good at trying to figure out how to integrate another business into their own business, which is also kind of a skill by itself. And so they combine with businesses, and they think it's going to be terrific. It's a strategic fit, and it ends up being a train wreck. And you can have companies go out of business for that reason too. So in all these things, I can give you the numbers and make the numbers look really good, but the essential ingredient is people. I mean, people is what makes things happen. And if people can't feel comfortable doing it, then they shouldn't do it.
Cool. Hey, Chris, unfortunately, we are out of time. So I'm going to bet that people are going to want to buy your book. I know I certainly am going to buy your book and read it, because I want to see how I can apply it to the folks we work with and see if there's some better ways of thinking about financing. At any rate, how would they find you, and how would they find your book?
Sure. So I'm obviously available on LinkedIn, so you can see me that way, and I get notes on LinkedIn all the time. I'll have a website that's going to be up called thevalueequation.com. So that'll be up there, and I will have, I've got a lot of podcasts and articles that'll be coming out, and I'll be posting things to that from time to time. There'll be some material that'll be supportive. I'll probably have some spreadsheets on there. It'll be easy for people to do. I mean, the whole formula is 6 variables, so it's not that complicated. And then if they want to buy the book, I'm on Amazon, or other books. So you go to the Wiley Publishing website. It's available for pre-order. The book should be out on May 10th.
Cool. And I've got 2 things I'd like you to do. And for about, the last 7 years, I've asked you to do the first thing, which is please go to wherever you're listening to this podcast and subscribe. And while you're at it, leave us an honest rating and review. It always helps us be found. If you love us, tell us you love us. If you don't, well, I'll cry a little bit, but I'll get over it. And the second thing is, I've been writing a newsletter now for about 45 years, and it's gone from all sorts of iterations, but right now it's about 800 to 1,000 words a week, which takes you about 4 minutes to read, about something that will make your blue-collar business and construction company better than it was before you read it. So it's really easy to get. You go to www.stage2planning.com/newsletter, and you just put in your first name and your email address, and every Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock, you'll have our newsletter showing up in your inbox. So this is Josh Patrick. We're with Chris Volk. You're at Cracking the Cash Flow Code. Thanks a lot for stopping by. I hope to see you back here really soon.